Bigger does not necessarily mean better, and quantity is no substitute for quality. If you ever needed proof of the veracity of those two statements, you need look no further than Bethesda Game Studio's latest release, Starfield. For context, I have been a fan of the studio for a long old time. The love affair started donkeys ago with Morrowind back in 2002, which by the by I even suffered through a second time on the original Xbox a year or two after release, still not sure why, and I absolutely adored Oblivion and Fallout 3. I liked Skyrim, Fallout 4 was fine, and I completely skipped Fallout 76. And even though I have enjoyed Bethesda's more recent titles to varying degrees, it's been my view for a good while that their standards have slowly been slipping. Starfield has only served to solidify that idea in my mind, because after 25 hours or so, longer than I spend playing most games, I have decided to take a break, perhaps never to return, because Starfield is a bit naff. Before we get cracking proper, I also just want to immediately nip this idea in the bud I've seen online that 25 hours or somewhere around that playtime is barely enough time to scratch the surface, and that you need to play the game for 30, 50 or 100 hours to truly understand its majesty. I don't even spend 25 hours over the course of a week or two doing things I actually enjoy, so to say I've not given it a fair shake is bonkers. And let me tell you right now, I would rather eat my own hands than spend another 25 hours playing Starfield. Let's talk about why. Well, for starters, Starfield's performance is absolutely horrendous. I am fortunate enough to have a very capable PC which can handle most titles at 4K with a good frame rate using close to highest settings, not accounting for ray tracing, and yet this particular slice of space-based nonsense brings my computer to its knees. Thankfully, I do have an Nvidia 40 series graphics card, so I have at least been able to mod in DLSS and frame generation, which has improved things significantly. The performance issues would all be at least somewhat forgivable too if Starfield looked the business, but most of the time it comes nowhere close to that. A lot of the time it looks atrocious. Every so often, when the lighting works properly during indoor sections, when you visit a ship with an interesting interior, or when you land on a particularly striking planet, you might be tricked into thinking it's a good-looking game. That impression will remain only until you encounter one of the many NPCs dotted throughout the world, all of them dead-eyed plasticine-faced monsters whose faces are able to display the same range of emotions as my kettle. There are many aspects of Starfield's visuals which look like they've been taken straight from a game released in 2010, but the NPCs are by far and away the most egregious. Considering this is a game during which a lot of your time is spent chatting to people, the idea that Bethesda was happy with the beady-eyed little nightmares they've strewn across their game world is mind-blowing to me. They also still spend the majority of their time stood or sat completely still while talking to you, and although that again may have been acceptable a decade ago, now that games like The Witcher have shown us how good dialogue can be while retaining a level of dynamism to character movement, the gawping statues in Starfield simply do not cut the mustard. Even if its graphics were polished across the board, it wouldn't matter a whole lot either, as Starfield is desperately unimaginative. Those NPCs with the serial killer stares aren't going to endear themselves any more to you once they open their mouths, as the voice acting is average at best, and most of the time they don't have much exciting to say either. I know Mass Effect is a different style of RPG from Starfield, but look, they're both RPGs and they're both set in space, so throw me a frickin' bone here. But when I first entered the Citadel after playing through the opening of Mass Effect and began talking to important characters and random NPCs, I straight away learnt a ton about its world. Whether I was being given information regarding the machinations of certain big players in its universe, or learning about the cultures and conflicts of different alien races, didn't matter. I was hooked from the off and desperate to learn as much as possible from minute one. Starfield, for me, has a tendency to somehow only cover most topics at surface level, despite most characters being quite verbose, and a phrase you might hear me use again during this video, although I'll try not to, is vast but not deep. There are a lot of people to talk to, and there is a lot of dialogue to get through. However, I've never once felt myself getting anywhere near as invested as I have previously with games like Mass Effect, or indeed Bethesda's earlier titles. This lack of inspiration when it comes to world building extends to Starfield's general aesthetic as well, which is also plain, uninteresting, and about as by the numbers as it could possibly be. Its world is mostly filled with just about the most generic space stuff you could possibly think of. I consider myself to be a terribly unimaginative person in general, and Starfield and its world is exactly the kind of thing I'd think up if someone put a gun to my head and told me to come up with something similar. For the record, that's pretty bad. For some people, not having dragons flying around, kids trapped in fridges for an absurd amount of time, or any wackiness whatsoever will be a plus point, but for me it feels about as low effort and down the middle as you could possibly go. Starfield's world can't hold a candle to Fallout or Elder Scrolls and the wonderful amount of imagination oozing from every corner of their worlds. The biggest disappointment for me is that Bethesda has, for whatever stupid reason, taken what I consider to be their unique selling point and taken a big steaming you-know-what all over it. Bethesda's classic gameplay loop has always been their old reliable, the feature one can always look forward to irrespective of preferences surrounding setting or story. You head out into vast open worlds, sometimes on the way to complete a quest, sometimes with no goal in mind, before you then get distracted by a building in the distance or the appearance of a strange NPC. Before you know it, what should have been a 15-minute jaunt has turned into 3 hours of travelling, fighting and looting, with the quest you originally set out to complete yet to be ticked off your list. This combination of exploration, discovery and reward has always been like a drug to me. Once I get into the rhythm of wandering around one of Bethesda's worlds, I find it nigh on impossible to stop. What will be to some Starfield's greatest asset, its setting or settings, has thrown something of a spanner in the works, a really big spanner covered in rusty nails which gives you tetanus. The problem is segmentation. In previous Bethesda games, there have always been towns, cities, and other assorted hubs which are simultaneously connected to the open world, while also in a way being disconnected from it thanks to loading screens. That's never been a huge deal though. If you're anything like me, you pop back to them once in a blue moon to finish off a few quests or pick up new ones, then head back out into the world for another extended mosey. There's a loading screen when you enter and a loading screen when you leave, and there might be one or two when entering buildings, but it's all perfectly manageable. In Starfield, by comparison, there is no single curated world for you to explore. Rather, there is a selection of hubs where you stock up on quests, and then 1,000,001 planets across which many of your objectives are spread. In order to start clearing your big fat to-do list, you then have to spend ages taking off and landing and fast travelling all over the place, with each portion of your journey broken up by a procession of loading screens. There will also likely be several more once you reach your destination too. I originally planned to make a joke here along the lines of Starfield, more like loading screen field, but I decided not to because A, I'm not very funny, and B, it's so dissatisfying a gameplay loop that I struggle to find any humour in it. It completely destroys any sense of pacing. The counter-argument will of course be that the exploration side of things comes into play when visiting the vast array of planets, most of which you are able to land on. As you touch down on one, the world and a number of points of interest will be generated around you, and they are mostly absolute dreck. At first, they may flatter to deceive, but the more you play, the quicker you'll come to realise that most of it is the same content on repeat, with the occasional change in geometry, building layout or enemy variety. It's all content which is very much like space itself, cold, impersonal, vacuous. So, to boil down what I've just spoken about, you usually end up spending a lot of your time playing Starfield doing one of two things. You'll either be running around procedurally generated planets heading to the same old points of interest over and over again until you eventually consider putting a laser gun to your head, or you'll be fast travelling all over the shop, working through a list of handcrafted quests while constantly being interrupted by loading screens. In the game's defence, what I will say is that the faction quests in particular do still invoke memories of the Bethesda of old. I don't want to spoil too much, but the Deep Cover questline, for example, is excellent, and some tasks which seem small to begin with will still blossom into something quite marvellous, like the Mantis storyline. It's just so difficult to get into any kind of rhythm, however, when there always seems to be so much standing between you and any continuous period of fun. Every time I found myself starting to get truly absorbed, I'd have to do a load of fast travelling between locations, or spend way too much time running around one of the hubs talking to a load of NPCs who always have a lot to say about everything. Bethesda has continued to double down on more recent additions to their games, procedural generation, base building and the like, and in the process have whittled away at most of what made their games special to begin with. Getting lost in the worlds of Fallout or Elder Scrolls in the past always felt so effortless, whereas in the present, Bethesda makes you work for your entertainment. You really have to manage how you spend your time playing Starfield to avoid monotony setting in. And even doing so successfully may not be enough. I did my very best to switch things up and keep events varied, and I still ended up being bored to tears regularly. The performance issues, lack of imagination, and the erosion of the Bethesda gameplay loop are by far my biggest issues with Starfield, but before I conclude, it would be remiss of me not to also quickly touch on the litany of other awful design choices. Everything to do with maps in Starfield is horrendous. The star map is unintuitive to navigate, and you're basically on your own once you land somewhere. There may as well not even be any other maps for all the good they do you. This is such basic stuff, and it's genuinely staggering that Bethesda couldn't get it right. On a similar note, considering how much time you're going to be spending in menus, Starfield's UI is a masterclass in exactly how not to design a user interface. It is indecipherable to the point I often felt like a dog trying to read a newspaper every time I had the misfortune of needing to use it. Finally, the actual flying through space part of Starfield, which you'd think would be vital to the experience, is mostly pointless. You'll do it a few times until the novelty wears off and then not really bother with it much after. You will sometimes come across the odd random encounter, but it's not enough that spaceflight feels like a must-have mechanic as a result. There are a few other things I should also probably talk about, such as the boring companions, unexciting main quest, or the shameless, lazy recycling of Skyrim's most unique mechanic, but I'm at the point where I think I might give myself an aneurysm if I carry on moaning too much longer. Anyway, I know compared to my usual fare this video has been somewhat negative, so apologies for that. It's just one of those rare days where I'm not feeling great, and I thought ranting at people I've never met on the internet might prove therapeutic. If you're playing Starfield and having a whale of a time, then great. I'm sure there are many of you out there who will strongly disagree with what I've said during this video. Ultimately, for me however, I can't help but feel incredibly disappointed by how the game has turned out. What I expected after so much development time was at minimum a polished modern take on the Bethesda formula, where in actuality a lot of Starfield either feels like it's a decade or more past its sell-by date, or like Bethesda's focus has been on completely the wrong things. I really wanted to like Starfield, I promise you I really wanted to like it, but after 25 hours I've pretty much decided to call it quits. Thanks for watching the video, boys, girls and cosmonauts. If you thought it was out of this world, do consider liking, subscribing and sharing your thoughts, and all's well, we'll catch up again soon.